Welcome back to History Entertainment's complete U.S. history series. We've declared independence. Now we have to fight for it. In Episode 2, we witnessed the winning of the Revolutionary War, the forging of the Constitution, and the unsteady first steps of a new nation. News of the Declaration hit New York City like a thunderclap. On July 9, 1776, after hearing the words read aloud, a rowdy crowd of soldiers and citizens rushed to Bowling Green. They threw ropes around the massive lead statue of King George III and tore it down. In a poetic twist of irony, they melted the king into 42,000 musket balls to fire back at his own troops. Desperation breeds invention. That same summer, the Americans launched the world's first combat submarine, the Turtle. It was a one-man wooden acorn, hand-cranked and dangerously claustrophobic. Sergeant Ezra Lee tried to attach a bomb to a British flagship in New York Harbor. The mission failed, but it proved the Americans were willing to try absolutely anything to break the British blockade. By Christmas 1776, the Revolution was dying. Washington had lost New York and his army was dissolving. He needed a miracle. In a sleet storm on Christmas night, he led 2,400 freezing men across the ice-choked Delaware River. It wasn't the heroic painting we know. It was a dark, wet, miserable gamble to save the cause from total collapse. The gamble paid off. The next morning, they caught the Hessian mercenaries in Trenton completely by surprise, sleeping off their Christmas celebrations. The battle was short and decisive. Washington captured nearly the entire garrison. It wasn't a strategic masterstroke, but it was a massive psychological victory. It proved the Continental Army could actually fight. But the British weren't the biggest killer. Disease was. Smallpox was ravaging the ranks. In a controversial move, Washington ordered the mass inoculation of his troops at Morristown. It was risky, primitive medicine, infecting healthy men with live virus to build immunity. Some died from the procedure, but the army survived the plague. It was Washington's greatest strategic decision of the war. The turning point came in upstate New York in 1777. British General Burgoyne, bogged down in the wilderness, was surrounded by American militia. In the battle, Benedict Arnold, yes, that Benedict Arnold, led a heroic charge that shattered the British lines. Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. It was the victory that finally convinced the world America might actually win. Benjamin Franklin was in Paris, using Saratoga to close the deal. He charmed the French court, wearing a fur cap and playing the role of the rustic genius. It worked. King Louis XVI signed the Treaty of Alliance. Suddenly, Britain wasn't just fighting a colonial rebellion. They were fighting a world war against a superpower. But before French help arrived, the army had to survive the winter of 1777 at Valley Forge. It was a city of log huts and misery. 2,500 men died of starvation, disease, and exposure. Yet, thanks to the Prussian drill master Baron von Steuben, the survivors emerged in the spring not as a ragtag mob, but as a disciplined, professional fighting force. The war went to sea. John Paul Jones, a Scottish outlaw turned American naval captain, took the fight to Britain's own backyard. In a brutal battle off the English coast, his ship, the Bonhomme Richard, was sinking. When the British captain asked if he surrendered, Jones replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." He lashed the ships together and won in hand-to-hand combat. Heroes can break. Benedict Arnold, bitter over lack of recognition and mounting debts, decided to sell out his country. He plotted to hand over the fortress of West Point to the British for £20,000. The plot was discovered at the last minute. Arnold escaped on a British ship, but his name became a synonym for traitor forever. The end came at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington's army and the French fleet trapped Lord Cornwallis against the sea. Day and night, artillery pounded the British lines. Finally, trapped and out of food, the British surrendered. As they marched out to lay down their muskets, their band reportedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." The war was won, but the peace was fragile. The army, unpaid and angry, threatened to overthrow Congress. Washington faced his rebellious officers in Newburgh. He pulled out a letter, then paused to put on spectacles, saying, "I have grown gray in your service, and now find myself growing blind." The officers wept. The coup evaporated. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized the United States of America as an independent nation, with borders stretching all the way to the Mississippi River. The American negotiators posed for a painting, but the British refused to sit for it, leaving the canvas and the relationship unfinished. Independence was messy. The new nation was governed by the Articles of Confederation, which were terrible. The central government couldn't tax, couldn't raise an army, and couldn't stop states from printing their own worthless money. America wasn't a nation. It was a bickering club of 13 mini-countries on the verge of economic collapse. The breaking point was Shays' Rebellion. In Massachusetts, war veterans who hadn't been paid were losing their farms to debt. Led by Daniel Shays, they marched on courthouses with muskets, shutting down the government. The terrifying realization hit everyone. The United States had no army to stop them. Anarchy was knocking at the door. Summer, 1787. 55 men gathered in Philadelphia to fix the government. They ended up overthrowing it. To keep their debates secret, they nailed the windows shut, sweltering in wool suits through the humid summer. For 4 months, they argued over everything: big states versus small states, freedom versus slavery, and the frightening idea of a president. Then came the compromise that would haunt the nation. The South wanted enslaved people counted for representation. The North did not. The result was the 3/5 compromise, writing into the Constitution that a human being in chains counted as 60% of a person. It preserved the Union for now, but planted the seeds of the Civil War. On September 17th, it was finished. As the delegates lined up to sign, Benjamin Franklin looked at the sun carved into the back of Washington's chair. He said he had often wondered if it was rising or setting. "But now," he said, "I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." Writing it was one thing, getting the states to agree was another. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay launched a massive PR campaign called the Federalist Papers. They wrote 85 essays in 6 months, brilliantly explaining why this new government was necessary to save liberty, not destroy it. There was never any doubt who would be the first president. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington stepped onto the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. He was the only man everyone trusted with this new power. As he took the oath, he was visibly trembling, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of knowing that if he failed, the Republic died with him. Many states only ratified the Constitution on one condition: a Bill of Rights. In 1791, 10 amendments were added, guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, the press, and trial by jury. It was a promise that the federal government would have limits, a shield for the citizen against the state. In 1793, a young tutor named Eli Whitney invented a machine that changed everything. The cotton gin could clean seeds from cotton 50 times faster than a human hand. Suddenly, cotton became white gold. Slavery, which had been dying out, exploded in profitability. This one invention ensured the South would never give up its peculiar institution without a fight. The new government was tested immediately. Farmers in Pennsylvania, angry about a tax on whiskey, refused to pay and attacked tax collectors. Washington didn't blink. He put his old uniform back on and rode at the head of 13,000 troops, the only time a sitting president has led an army in the field. The rebels scattered. The message was clear: the laws of the Union would be enforced. Peace was unpopular. To avoid another war with Britain, Washington sent John Jay to negotiate a treaty. It was a weak deal that favored the British, and the public hated it. Mobs burned John Jay in effigy in the streets. But Washington signed it anyway. He knew the young nation wasn't strong enough to fight a war yet. He bought America time. In 1796, Washington did something no king had ever done. He walked away. He refused a third term, setting the two-term precedent that lasted for nearly 150 years. In his farewell address, he warned the nation against two things: political parties and foreign alliances. We ignored both warnings almost immediately. John Adams had the impossible job of following the father of the country. Short, grumpy, and brilliant, he walked into a political minefield. The French, angry at Jay's treaty, began seizing American ships. When Adams sent diplomats to fix it, 3 French agents, known as X, Y, and Z, demanded a bribe. The nation screamed for war, but Adams, knowing the Navy was too weak, stubbornly chose peace. Paranoia overtook the administration. Fearful of French spies and political criticism, Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. It became a crime to criticize the president. Journalists were thrown in jail. It was a massive overreach that violated the very Bill of Rights the founders had just written, and it doomed Adams's presidency. On December 14th, 1799, the unthinkable happened. George Washington died of a throat infection at Mount Vernon. The nation stopped. He was the glue that held the fractured states together. Even in France, Napoleon ordered a week of mourning. His death marked the end of the Revolutionary era and left the young republic to fend for itself. The election of 1800 was a nightmare. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied in the Electoral College. It went to the House of Representatives for 35 deadlocked votes. Finally, Alexander Hamilton, who hated Jefferson but thought Burr was a dangerous sociopath, intervened. He convinced Federalists to elect his old enemy, Jefferson, to save the Republic from ruin. Thomas Jefferson called it the Revolution of 1800. It was the first time in modern history that power passed peacefully from one political party to another. He walked to his own inauguration in simple clothes, rejecting the pomp of Europe. "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists," he said, trying to heal the wounds of the bitter campaign. But the real power grab happened in the courts. In Marbury v. Madison, Chief Justice John Marshall, a Federalist appointed at the last minute by Adams, pulled a brilliant maneuver. He struck down a law as unconstitutional. In doing so, he established judicial review, giving the Supreme Court the final say on what the Constitution actually means. Jefferson was a strict constitutionalist, but when Napoleon offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million, he couldn't say no. He had to ignore his own principles to double the size of the country overnight. It was the greatest real estate deal in history, less than 3 cents an acre for an empire of liberty. To find out what he just bought, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They led the Corps of Discovery up the Missouri River into the unknown. They were looking for a water route to the Pacific, the Northwest Passage. They didn't find it because it didn't exist, but they found a continent of wonder and danger. While Lewis and Clark explored, tragedy struck at home. Vice President Aaron Burr, humiliated by Alexander Hamilton for the last time, challenged him to a duel. On a cliff in Weehawken, New Jersey, the Vice President of the United States shot and killed the former Treasury Secretary. It remains the most shocking moment in American political history. The Corps of Discovery would have failed without a teenage Shoshone girl named Sacagawea. Kidnapped as a child and sold to a French trapper, she guided the expedition with her baby on her back. When they reached the Rockies, she miraculously recognized the local chief as her long-lost brother, securing the horses they desperately needed to cross the mountains. Caught between warring Britain and France, Jefferson tried peaceable coercion. He passed the Embargo Act, banning all American ships from foreign trade. It was a disaster. It didn't stop the war in Europe, but it destroyed the American economy. Ships rotted at the docks in New England, and smuggling became a patriotic duty. But American innovation couldn't be stopped. Robert Fulton launched the Clermont, the first commercially successful steamboat. Critics called it Fulton's Folly, until they saw it chugging up the Hudson River against the current. It shrank the continent, turning rivers into two-way highways for commerce. The Constitution protected the international slave trade for 20 years. On January 1st, 1808, that protection expired, and Congress banned the importation of enslaved people. It ended the legal transatlantic trade, but tragically, it did nothing to stop the buying and selling of human beings within the United States, which only grew more brutal. James Madison, the quote-unquote father of the Constitution, inherited a mess. British ships were seizing American vessels and kidnapping sailors, a practice called impressment. A new generation of young congressmen, the quote-unquote war hawks, led by Henry Clay, screamed for blood. They wanted to invade Canada and drive the British off the continent forever. On the frontier, a Shawnee leader named Tecumseh was building a massive native confederacy to stop white expansion. While Tecumseh was away recruiting, General William Henry Harrison attacked his headquarters at Prophetstown. The Battle of Tippecanoe was a chaotic dawn raid that shattered Tecumseh's dream of a united native nation. Pushed too far, Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war. It passed by the narrowest margin in history. The United States, a toddler of a nation with almost no navy and a tiny army, had just declared war on the greatest superpower on Earth. Again. The war on land was a disaster, but at sea, the unthinkable happened. The USS Constitution met the HMS Guerriere. When British cannonballs bounced harmlessly off her live oak hull, a sailor shouted, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron!" The legend of Old Ironsides was born, shocking the invincible Royal Navy. In 1814, the British nightmare arrived. Veteran troops from the Napoleonic Wars marched into Washington, D.C. President Madison fled on horseback. His wife, Dolly, paused just long enough to save a portrait of George Washington before the British torched the White House. The capital of the United States was reduced to smoking ruins. The British moved to Baltimore, expecting another easy win. But Fort McHenry held. Through a night of torrential rain and relentless bombardment, the Americans refused to lower the flag. A lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched from a truce ship, scribbling a poem on the back of an envelope. The Star-Spangled Banner. Both sides were exhausted. In Ghent, Belgium, negotiators signed a peace treaty on Christmas Eve, 1814. It settled nothing. No territory changed hands, and impressment wasn't even mentioned. It was a draw. But for the Americans, surviving against Britain a second time felt like a victory. News traveled slow. 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed, the British attacked New Orleans. General Andrew Jackson, with a motley army of pirates, frontiersmen, and free black soldiers, decimated the British elite. It was the greatest American land victory of the war, propelling Jackson to stardom and forging a new sense of national pride. The Federalist Party, having opposed the war, dissolved in disgrace. James Monroe took office in 1817, launching the Era of Good Feelings. For a brief moment, there was only one political party. The economy was booming, the borders were secure, and the nation turned its eyes inward to growth. New York took the lead. Governor DeWitt Clinton broke ground on the Erie Canal, a 363-mile ditch connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. Critics laughed, but thousands of Irish immigrants dug it by hand. When it opened, it transformed New York City into the economic capital of the world. The good feelings didn't last. In 1819, the economy crashed. It was the first major boom and bust cycle of capitalism. Banks failed, land values plummeted, and thousands of Americans lost their farms. It was a harsh lesson. In a market economy, what goes up can come crashing down. Then, the slavery question exploded. Missouri wanted to join the Union as a slave state, threatening to upset the balance of power in Congress. Former President Jefferson called the crisis a fire bell in the night. The compromise admitted Missouri as slave and Maine as free, drawing a line across the map. It silenced the argument, but didn't solve it. With Latin American colonies declaring independence from Spain, Monroe made a bold move. He issued the Monroe Doctrine, warning European powers that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for colonization. "Stay out of our backyard," he essentially said. It was a bluff. The U.S. Navy was tiny, but the British Navy enforced it for their own reasons. The era of good feelings ended in a four-way brawl. In 1824, Andrew Jackson won the most votes, but not a majority. The election went to the House, where Henry Clay threw his support to John Quincy Adams. Jackson screamed, "Corrupt bargain!" It was the end of the Gentleman's Republic and the birth of modern, ruthless politics. John Quincy Adams was arguably the smartest man to ever be president, and one of the least effective. He wanted to build a national university, observatories, and a vast road system. But his enemies in Congress, loyal to Jackson, blocked him at every turn. He spent 4 miserable years as a president without a party. Independence was secured and the Constitution ratified, but the young republic now faces a vast, unknown continent. In the next episode, we will explore the explosive era of manifest destiny and the dark clouds gathering on the horizon.